Yesterday, we tried to devote much of our attention to advocacy at the local level, and today we're going to turn our attention more to issues of state and national interest. And we have a wonderful panel this morning, and we're going to just change the way that we're doing things a little bit because our first speaker has to leave. It has other obligations. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this a little bit differently than what you might have seen in your program. We're going to start with Jere Hochman, and Jere is the governor's deputy secretary for education. He comes to the governor's office following a number of years as superintendent in the Bedford School District, which is in the Mount Kisco area of Westchester County. He has spent time in Massachusetts. He has spent time in St. Louis, and he began his educational career as an English teacher. Once Jere has had an opportunity to speak, I've taken questions from a number of people, and I'm going to address a number of questions to him. He'll have an opportunity to respond to some of those questions, and then what we're going to do is we're going to bring our panel up here, and we're going to have our panel moderated by Keshia Clukey, who is an education reporter with Politico. And Keshia is an award-winning journalist who has come to Albany within the past year and is covering education issues very extensively. Keshia will be joined on the panel and will be posing questions to two other people. One is Kyle Belokopitsky. Kyle is an employee of NYSUT, and she is NYSUT's representative for P12 education. And she communicates NYSUT's positions to the legislature. She has worked in the past for the New York State Council of Superintendents and also as a government relations specialist for the New York Catholic Schools Conference. She'll also be joined by Larry Spring. Larry is the superintendent of the Schenectady City School District. And he has been an advocate for disadvantaged and people living in poverty for most of his educational career. And he's taken on the challenges of a school district that is a high-needs school district and brings that perspective to us. So that's the panel that we will have, but we're first going to bring Jere Hochman, and Jere will have some comments, and then I will pose some questions that address those comments, and then the panelists can get into that a little bit further. Jere?
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you today. It's a beautiful day outside. I just drove in early this morning, and it was a wonderful drive, and it's always good to be here, and it's great to see you coming together. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to the State PTA for inviting me to be here today. Rick Longhurst, thank you very much for your invitation, and President Bonnie Russell, thank you very much. I truly appreciate being here. After my short time with you this morning, I hope that you will walk away with these thoughts. First, it is with great pride that I have the opportunity to bring 40 years of experience as a teacher, principal, and superintendent to the governor's office. Rick alluded to my experience. I'll talk about that momentarily. With only a few months working in the executive chamber, I can assure you that Governor Cuomo and those in the governor's office have the education, the best interests, and the future of every child in their sights, and they understand how this works out and plays out in the field across New York schools and communities, and always learning more. Second, Governor Cuomo is aware of the issues swirling around education reform nationally and in New York in recent years. This is why last fall he put the brakes on the state education department's rushed reforms and convened an education task force of experts to hear from educators and parents from across the state. The governor stands ready to assist with the implementation and the recommendations of the task force, including the 3-year transition period necessary to get it right. Third, it is always a pleasure to speak with parents, and I appreciate, again, having this opportunity to do so today. So welcome. As a longtime middle school teacher, assistant principal, and principal, I am well aware of the work, dedication, and time our parent leaders and volunteers in the schools devote literally in the schools. As a superintendent who met with the PTA presidents in my districts monthly, I am aware of the support that you provide volunteering, coordinating all of those fundraisers and fundraisers, ensuring routine communications, and making those appeals for committee chairpersons at back-to-school nights. And I can't tell you how many times my first question to a principal calling about a particular situation was, well, have you bounced it off your PTA president yet? You have a critically important role in making education work, and most at stake depending on our school success for our students. After all, local control, engaging parents, local educators, and community members, local control is the foundation of our educational system, and your participation exemplifies the how and the why it works. Today, I would like you to know how excited I am, and yes, excited, and honored to bring my passion for pre-K-12 and lifelong learning, and to bring suburban, rural, and urban experience to my role as Deputy Secretary of Education for Governor Cuomo. My first position as a superintendent was in a 22,000 student suburban school district with a wide spectrum of socioeconomic diversity, and where 25% of the students were urban students choosing to participate in one of the nation's largest voluntary desegregation programs. My second superintendent position was actually serving as superintendent of 3 school districts simultaneously. One rural district with 100 students, one college town elementary district, and a regional 7 through 12 secondary district educating the students from those elementary districts and from 2 additional rural school districts. Most recently, I was superintendent for 7 years in the diverse Bedford Central School District here in New York. And being quite active in NYSUT, the New York State Superintendent Organization, I have learned a great deal about the similarities and the differences of New York's 700 school districts and their unique expectations and unique needs across the state. I may not have walked in every one of your shoes, but I have a pretty good understanding of the experiences you face in your respective districts and regions. The governor is committed to ensuring that your diverse needs and interests, and those all across the state, are heard and are understood. Of course, in spite of efforts to seek balance and to address those unique needs, every state policy and funding decision will not be universally popular. I can assure you, however, that the governor and staff are doing our homework and listening. In recent years, the governor has challenged the educational status quo and has provided unprecedented levels of support for public schools. Under Governor Cuomo's leadership, school aid has increased year after year, reaching a historic high of $23.5 billion in 2015. Graduation rates have increased. 3- and 4-year-old children are filling a record number of pre-kindergarten seats. Failing schools and struggling educators are being addressed. The academic and financial pathway from high school to college is being paved, and the struggle with educational reform has been confronted head-on. Accordingly, this year Governor Cuomo proposes to significantly increase the state's investment into public education and into our public schools, an increase of $2.1 billion over 2 years, including a nearly $1 billion increase this school year for next school year alone. The governor's proposal will provide operating aid increases to every school district in the state and will once again move statewide education support to record levels. Of this almost $1 billion increase, the school aid increase of $961 million provides $266.4 million for foundation aid, $189.4 million toward ending the gap elimination adjustment, $100 million for community schools, and $405.3 million for the reimbursement of expense-based aids. The governor proposes to eliminate the gap elimination adjustment, the outstanding $434 million over 2 years, as well as provide an operating aid increase to every school district in the state. This 2-year plan to eliminate the GEA allows school districts a predictable revenue stream to enhance the long-term financial planning and support responsible budget practices locally. In addition, $28 million of the governor's budget is proposed to grant programs including expanding access to half-day and full-day programs for 3-year-olds, enhancing the monitoring and the review of early childhood settings, expanding access to early college and career and technical education, CTE programs, including the proposed Smart Transfer program to allow more early college high school students to obtain associate degrees while in high school at no cost to the students, and later to transfer successfully to a 4-year program. And making efforts to eliminate barriers that prevent students with disabilities and English language learners from participating in CTE programs. The governor's proposal also modifies current provisions for school safety plans, requires annual emergency training for all staff, and the designation of an administrator as the district chief emergency officer. In addition, the governor proposes requiring that 4 of the 12 required fire drills now become emergency response drills, and that should 180 days of attendance be compromised due to a credible safety threat which has occurred in the past, the commissioner would be authorized to forgive a reduction in state aid. All of these proposals, of course, are subject to approval by the legislature. In recent years, Governor Cuomo has taken measures to rein in spending, enhance efficiencies, leverage management and public engagement, and raise the bar for academic success. Simultaneously, New York, like all states, has been immersed in unprecedented federal regulation, a national reform movement, and expectations to accomplish everything at once. Last fall, Governor Cuomo recognized the need to reboot the system. In spite of reforms that were well-intended, there was growing consternation over simultaneous and flawed implementation of those reforms. Governor Cuomo established the task force to undertake a thorough review of academic standards, curriculum, and assessments. The task force heard testimony from educational experts in curriculum, special education, English language learning, and assessment. Members listened intently to parents, teachers, university professors, and administrators. Overall, the commission held 12 sessions, including 2 open sessions with presentations by parents, educators, and curriculum experts, held 9 regional listening forums where citizens addressed the task force, and 1 student engagement workshop. Overall, the task force heard from over 2,100 people, including over 1,800 website submissions with compelling personal stories and recommendations from parents and educators across the state, and every submission was read. In the end, the task force provided a 50-page report. If you've not seen it, that's what it looks like. It's online. Provided a 50-page report of substantive analysis and 21 recommendations. I expect that you are aware of the recommendations. However, if you have not done so, I encourage you to read the entire report. It is a frank and honest narrative of the past and a thoughtful, transparent, and inclusive road map for the future. In his address to the state in January, Governor Cuomo stated, "Last year we made dramatic changes. We reduced testing, we increased parental participation and empowered local districts. These reforms were essential because we saw that parents were losing faith in the system. Roughly 20% of our students opted out of exams, and in some districts, it was as high as 90% opted out. Simply put, The education system fails without parent trust. Our goal was to restore that trust, and we said we would correct the State Education Department's Common Core curriculum implementation mistakes and testing regimen. Time has shown that this was the right decision. The recommendations of that task force call for a 3-year transition period, which includes a review and subsequent development of rigorous and developmentally appropriate New York academic standards, design and selection of locally controlled curriculum, and creation of assessments designed to match their intended purpose, and specifically the design of standardized tests that are shorter in length and duration to provide you with the data necessary to benchmark your schools, districts, subgroups of students. Furthermore, the recommendations distinguish the purpose of standardized tests from the use of ongoing authentic assessments, not high-stakes tests, as the basis to assess individual student progress, communicate student learning to parents, and design intervention and acceleration of learning throughout the school year. Noteworthy is the governor's urging of the State Education Department to do it right this time. He has made his office fully available to assist and monitor the effort. Academic expectations remain high, yet the pressures of high-stakes testing, test prep, and consequences for performance on standardized tests have been eliminated. However, there is still a lot of work to do. We now have the opportunity to get teachers and school leaders engaged to revise the standards to become New York standards, to write the state tests, and to ensure that the tests are significantly shorter and that they are developmentally appropriate. And we now have 3 years to examine the accountability systems best suited to identify our best teachers and those who need greater assistance to improve and those who need a change of profession. I look forward to assisting in that work on behalf of the governor, and as the governor has said, we will not rest until our K-12 system is the best in the nation. It's my honor to work with the governor on this effort. It's my honor to serve the state of New York in this effort and to work with you. So thank you very much. Grab a water.
Sure. I got to figure out how to turn this on.
Okay.
Push and hold the button on the bottom. Okay. Jere, over the past couple of days, we've been collecting some questions that we wanted to direct to you, and I've crossed them out as I've sat here and listened to your comments. But I still have a couple of questions that I would like to direct to you.
Sure.
The governor's budget, with everything that you responded to in terms of the recommendations of the Common Core Task Force, we note that the governor's budget includes no funding for either family engagement initiatives proposed by the regents or to implement recommendations of the Common Core Task Force. If these two initiatives are high priority, how do you feel that they should be supported?
Thank you. 2 points there about the engagement and the professional development and the implementation of the task force recommendations. First, let me talk about the engagement aspect of it. When I think about parent engagement and community engagement, that is as local as it gets. As I think of it often, I think about the school, the role of the superintendent, the role of the school leaders, the role of the school principals in engagement. That's at the top of their list of initiatives. The entire community needs to be invited to be in the discussion. They also take the initiative for grassroots efforts on their own. And we know a lot of community agencies and support groups have stepped up to say, here we are, we stand ready to help, and here are some of our thoughts and recommendations. And the conduit for that actually are groups like the PTA. the local school PTA, the local school district PTA representatives and leaders working together with the school leadership to say, how can we bridge all of this and make sure that we are listening to the community, that there are mechanisms to listen to the community, whether it's opinion surveys, whether it's reaching out into open forums or other means of doing so. But that's as local as it gets. Still within the governor's budget, for example, the $100 million for community schools, that's a broad term at community schools. It includes so many various components of wraparound services, additional services for students, bringing the community together, and community engagement is a critical component of that, and that funding can be used for that particular purpose. So I believe it's also through organizations like the state PTA Association, like others that bring folks together from the state, from across the state, to talk about what are the best means of engagement and to make sure that the entire state is heard as well.
Okay, thank you. Last night, Regent Johnson alluded to this, but in recent years, data have been presented that characterize New York State as having the most educationally segregated system in the country. What is the governor's plan to address that form of charge?
Well, thank you, and I realize I spoke a lot about engagement. It is one of my favorite topics, so I didn't get to the other part of your question, but actually I can kind of put the two together. Because in terms of the recommendations of the task force, which focus on curriculum, which is something that is something that the state works on together, and bringing teachers together to be part of the writing of those standards, as well as the assessments. But it's that middle piece, the curriculum, which is local once again. And so the question is, what is the overall plan of SED? What is the overall plan of the state to work on those standards, to then provide opportunities for local school districts to be involved in writing their own and selecting curriculum, and then once again bringing everybody together for assessment. The question then is, I've heard this, of course, is where is the funding for professional development? Where is the funding for these activities? I don't want to get the cart out before the horse, and I think we need to see exactly what that plan is. The State Education Department released their timeline last week about some components of this plan, and I think that was welcomed, and I'm sure everybody was glad to see that. And so as plans get developed, then, of course, there'll be great discussion of how to support those locally as well as across the state. Simultaneously, in your question about segregated schools, yes, the governor is aware of that. We are all aware of that. We've seen the statistics. We also try to balance that out with some of the other components that contribute to that, and there's a lot of research that has been done on that, but a lot of homework needs to be done on that. As we look at charter school enrollments, we have to take a look at that as well, and that was addressed in the governor's proposals this year to take a look at those enrollments. So to say that there is a single plan, I think that's part of the process right now, is to say what is the overall plan and how do we work there together to figure out this very, very important issue.
Okay. Thank you. Mm-hmm. You alluded to the governor's proposed state aid increase of $961 million in the 2016-17 school year, while the Educational Conference Board and regents have requested increases that range from $2.2 to $2.4 billion. What criteria do you believe should be applied to determining an effective balance between those two proposals?
I think the process will work itself out. As you know, the governor's proposal is just like as a superintendent, you propose your budget and the school board takes it and they take a good hard look at it and they present it out to the community, and there's a lot of discussion over a couple of months, and then there's a determination. The governor has proposed a budget which, as I mentioned, is continuing to be one of the highest budgets proposed in our history. I was looking at Education Week recently, and their state-by-state report cards and review of every state in the country, and New York is #1 in funding. We look at all the variables that go into that, of course. So I think now we let the process work its way out and walk through all of the issues together.
Okay. Not sure how many states have constitutional obligation to provide a free public education, but New York State does have a constitutional obligation to fund a sound basic education. How do you believe that the state, or how does the governor believe that the state should determine what a sound basic education could cost? And it was interesting, last night we heard from a very talented group of students who translated the term sound basic education to barely adequate education. Mm-hmm. How should we determine what a sound basic education costs?
Now, I think a lot of folks are going to try to define that, excuse me, and a lot have already worked at it. As I think about it, excuse me one second. As I think about it, I just recognize that there are so many variables in it. Our school districts are different. There are so many different local needs. Those all need to be assessed. And so trying to come up with one single definition, I'm sure that there are those that will figure out their way to do that. I don't have a single answer for you on that one right now.
Okay, fair enough. Last question. The governor in recent years has inserted himself deeply into controversies surrounding questions of what students should learn, how education should be measured, and how educators should be evaluated. Mm-hmm. Who should be responsible for addressing these controversies, and what kinds of resources will be necessary to return education reform to a productive track?
The governor, in my mind, took a very bold step by establishing the Common Core Task Force last fall. There have been many movements and efforts in reform in New York. I was involved in the Regents Task Force the very first time it convened and talked about many of these issues of standards and local assessments and how it would all play out. And we all saw how that implementation occurred. Wheels were turning very fast, and they were turning simultaneously on many, many topics. And it was time to put the brakes on. And the governor did that this fall and said, it's time to stop, rethink this, reboot the system, take a look at it as a system, and then allow the time to have it work right and get it right this time over a 3-year period and not just repeat the past of rushing the implementation. There were 21 recommendations in the task force. I was pleased to hear, as a superintendent, quite frankly, and certainly working in the office as well, that the governor formally accepted those 21 recommendations and said these are the recommendations, and he accepts them. We've not seen that particularly around the country when different reports are made. And what that means is that there was an agreement, there was an acceptance of the recommendation for teachers, communities, experts to look at the standards, and that needs to be done. So there is a commitment to move forward there. Curriculum is local. There are state regulations, there are state expectations, there are state standards, but curriculum is local, and there's a great support and energy into local control of education. And I believe that's one way also to implement what these initiatives are. And assessment then comes back to the state so that it should be done connected to those standards. So I think the strategy, and I would say that the governor's plan, is to take a look, to have everyone now take a very, very close look at those recommendations, because it covers what education is all about with the kids in the middle. And if you read those recommendations, they talk about all children. They talk about children with students with disabilities. We had many speakers come in talking about English language learning, talking about students that need intervention, students that need acceleration, and that the need, and the word developmentally appropriate came up time and time again. Age appropriate came up time and time again. So if you can take all of what is education and capture it, I would say that this group that listened to experts, parents, and others from across the state came up with recommendations in those categories to do exactly what you just asked about, is how will we address this, and it will be mapped out and it will be done well because we'll have the time to do it right.
Thank you. Jere, we know that you've got a very busy schedule today. We thank you for taking the time. We promise to get you out of here quickly. We would like to leave you with a gift. We would like to leave you with a voluminous collection of our advocacy positions,
Right.
and for the group that's here and those who will be joining us tomorrow, there will be a number of us who will be sitting down with Jere and representatives of the governor's office to look at strategies for advancing our means of addressing the heroin and opiate issue in New York State, and we look forward to that discussion.
Right. Well, I've appreciated previous discussions we've had when groups have come in and you've come in to talk about the legislative platform and the issues facing the organization and parents across the state. Look forward to the discussion tomorrow, and thank you for the homework, because we do our homework.
Good. Jere, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to bring our panel up, Keshia Clukey, who will be our moderator, and we're going to readjust the chairs here so that Kyle and Keshia and Larry can can face each other. I would like to say for those of you who follow Twitter, if you look and follow Belokopitsky, Kyle does more tweeting and retweeting than anybody I've ever seen. So if you want to have a very up-to-the-minute, including this morning, analysis of what is going on right now, follow Kyle at Belokopitsky.
That's a good plug.
Okay. And Larry? And I'm going to turn this over to Keshia, and I'm going to find another mic so that the...
We can put on our mom voice. Right?
Yeah.
I'm going to bring it. We've got one here, so I'm going to do that.
Can you guys see us over here? Are you're good? No? Do we want to switch one door down? Okay. Is that a little better? All right. My mother's a teacher, so I also have a teacher voice, so we can pass it along and make sure that you hear it. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm excited to get into some of these topics. We have a number of topics that I know are near and dear to your hearts, that our panel is very passionate about, so we're going to try to cover a little bit of everything and then have some questions afterwards. So let's first start with the budget that Jere had discussed. This year it's $991 million, which is significantly shorter than the $2.4 billion that the regents had recommended. I'll have Kyle start with that. How do you remedy the difference between the two, and is the $1 billion enough?
Sure, Keshia, thank you. And thank you all for coming on the weekend. I know I left my 6-year-old at home with his dad fighting about whether he was going to go to church school. So I know what it's like to have these great commitments to advocate for our kids leaving your families at home. So thank you for taking the time. While I would agree that this year's school aid increase, which is actually $963 million, is what shows up on the school aid runs, is the largest starting point we've had in any memory that I've had, is that I've been advocating for this for 16 years. I must have started when I was 10, I know. It's significantly short of what is needed to fund adequately our schools. Just to maintain current services that are in our schools today, we need $1.7 billion. And that's not to add anything, that's not to give parents anything else, students anything else, educators any more training. The Educational Conference Board, which PTA, NYSUT, NISCUS, Larry's organization, sits on, said we need a minimum of $2.2 billion just to, again, fund our schools for this coming year. So it is inadequate. I know all of the education associations are really advocating for a significant school aid increase this year, especially because for the first time since the tax cap has enacted, we have a near 0% tax cap. What that means is that school districts are not going to be raising any local revenue across the state. So the state really has to make up that portion. A 2% tax cap would have equated to $700 million. That would have meant that local communities and school districts could have came up with $700 million on their own if they were able to. They're not able to. So we need the state to make up that $700 million. ECB is calling for 2.6, NYSUT's calling, or 2.2, NYSUT's calling for $2.6 billion. $963 million that are on the school aid runs just does not cut it.
And I'll pass a similar question to Larry. Governor Cuomo, and as was reflected by Jere just now, has repeatedly said that New York State, and we know New York State spends a lot of money on education. What is your response to that, and how do we determine what a sound basic education is and how to fund that properly?
So my response to that is always along the lines of we do spend more per pupil in New York State than just about every other state in the country. If we're not first, we're second, depending on the year. But I always request that the governor go back and take his basic 8th grade math course again, because saying that on average we spend more per pupil in a state that ranks so low in equity of that spending makes that statement meaningless. There are districts in this state that spend nearly $100,000 per pupil and districts that spend $13,000 per pupil. And to think that we don't need to spend any more, I think really ignores those those extremes and those realities. Every school is held to the same standard. Every child has the same constitutional right to a sound basic education. And when the state shorts school districts so dramatically, so like Schenectady, we only get 55% of the foundation aid that we're promised each year. That's about $60 million a year that we do not get in state aid. So you think about that $700 million figure, 60 million in one district of 10,000 students that we don't get. That's a significant shortfall, and it actually has a significant and paralyzing effect on the local economy in Schenectady. And we can debate a little bit about sound basic education, and I appreciate Jere's perspective that lots of people will try to define that, but it's been defined. The courts have been through that process. It's been defined. It's been enacted. There's a law that says this is what a meaningful education is. This is what sound basic education means. It's defined in those state test scores. It's defined in a high school diploma, and it's tied to those resources. And the fact that the governor is putting forth a proposal that exacerbates and seeks to perpetuate those inequities, I think is shameful.
And Keshia, I'll add that it's great to see the local perspective, the statewide perspective. Schools across the state are owed $4.4 billion under their CFE rulings, and then another $434 million with a gap elimination adjustment. So two different funding streams. In total, schools are still owed $4.8 billion. So while we appreciate the $963 million, it's not 4.8.
And there has been discussion about how that funding affects school districts in terms of we have a number of, as the governor calls them, failing schools, or as the state education department calls them, struggling schools, and then of course the issue of school segregation. And how does the funding play into that, and how do we overcome those issues? Is it just a matter of more funding, or is it something else that we need to do as a state? And I leave that open to both of you.
So it's not, there's no simple description and there's no simple answer to that, but it does begin, I believe, with that notion that New York State is the most segregated school system in the country. And there's some irony here. 61 years after Brown versus Board of Education, here's where we are. New York State, in the wake of Brown, sent people and spent money and resources to help other states desegregate. And here we are, the most segregated school system in the country. I think there's irony in that. So that means that in a state where the majority of our students are of color, they are concentrated in 55 districts. All right, 55 districts out of nearly 700 districts. So 8% of our districts are predominantly minority students. Those districts are 10 times as likely to receive less than 70% of their foundation aid, whereas districts that serve predominantly white students are much more likely to receive all of their foundation aid. Then, when you add the struggling schools piece, the receivership piece, every single one of the schools that they initially identified for receivership, I haven't gone over their new lists, every single school that they identified for receivership served predominantly minority students and was less than average wealth and was receiving less than 80% of their foundation aid. So the state has systematically created a segregated system, has systematically starved those minority schools of resources, and then has systematically identified them for receivership to take power and control away from the locality. Some of you may know I filed a civil rights complaint against New York State for the way in which they were distributing their funds. I amended that complaint to include the receivership issue as a part of that. I know as a school superintendent, if every single student that I suspended was black, the Office of Civil Rights would probably set up shop in my high school. The fact that the state is doing that in their identification of receivership, I think is a significant affront to the Civil Rights Act, and I think that it needs to be addressed loudly, that this is not the way. This is not the way that we advocate and serve our neediest students.
And we would agree with Larry, of course. On a statewide perspective, the receivership schools, the 144 schools that were originally identified, they were owed more than half of all of what was owed to the whole entire state. So, as Larry had mentioned, these states are typically high poverty school districts, very high minority populations, high homeless populations, and we've all talked about this. And as parent advocates, poverty is a real issue in New York, and it's a real issue for student learning, and that's something that we feel strongly that really needs to be addressed. We're actually having a conference here. NYSUT is having a conference here today on poverty and social justice issues for our students. We were appreciative that the governor did include another $100 million in his budget this year for struggling schools. We call them struggling. They're identified in law as failing schools, but struggling schools and persistently struggling schools. But we think still that number needs to drastically be increased through the Educational Conference Board. ECB has asked for another $75 million to support these struggling schools. And NYSUT has called for another $150 million to support the struggling schools, teachers, parents, and educators there. So it's a real issue. Other problems with receivership, and Larry and I were talking about it earlier. There are so many, issues facing the students in these schools, whether it's poverty and social issues, psychological issues, and really supportive of a community schools model. I know you are, Larry, and NYSUT is, and many of the education associations really hope that we can move towards a more supportive community schools model for struggling schools, as opposed to a punitive model. We know that replacing and firing generally very educated and successful teachers is not the solution to helping these students. They need a really whole student body focus where we can bring services into the schools, where we can have medical services and vision services. I spoke with one superintendent recently in a high needs school district, and she had said that over 80% of her students in first grade needed glasses. And so she brought in a vision program, and we're able to donate glasses for all of these students. Think about that. If 80% of your students needed glasses to read, how are they expected to succeed? That's really why it's important for parent groups and community groups to get involved with all school districts, and especially struggling school districts, to really support children and families there.
I think that the community schools model is a really great model, but again, this one of these places where there's a level of rationality that's missing. The community schools model takes a number of years to reach maturity, and the receivership model really looks at demanding results in a year or two. And so if you've not made demonstrable progress in a year, you're into takeover. That is a problem, especially when we know how intractable some of these issues are and what's happening with kids. Certainly there are those issues with eyeglasses, but when we're talking about the nature of what's happening in these neighborhoods and the things that these kids are wrestling with, as we look at our own schools in Schenectady, the percentage of these children who have a parent or both parents who are incarcerated, the level of incident with mental health issues, behavioral health issues in the home, these are not things that get solved quickly. These are things that require lots and lots of partnership beyond the school, and they take time to gain traction and provide that kind of support to help parents gain traction in their own lives and to create stability in the neighborhoods. To put a time limit on it of 1 year or 2 years just seems to fly in the face of logic.
You'll see a lot of head shaking between Larry and I. Larry was one of my former members. I represented Larry when I was with the Superintendents Association. And one thing that people think is they think that the statewide associations and groups we fight, and we don't. We agree on 99% of things. So you'll see a lot of commonality between PTA and superintendents, teachers, principals, and it makes, I think, our joint advocacy all stronger.
So along the lines of the importance of services, the governor's budget also included $22 million to expand universal pre-K, specifically for 3-year-olds. There are several pre-K, 3, 4-year-old programs, also trying to make sure that everyone has full-day kindergarten. Is the $22 million enough? And should the oversight of all of these different programs be with the state education department as opposed to a proposal in the governor's budget to move the pre-K to another department?
Sure. No, we feel that there needs to be a significant investment in pre-K. Again, through the Educational Conference Board, all of the statewide associations called for at least, ballpark $100 million going forward, at least investment this year alone. We think that it's critical, pre-K for 3K and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. I was lucky enough that I was able to afford pre-K for my child. We didn't have any universal or public pre-K options in my school district. So my son went to the local Catholic school where we paid tuition, a significant amount of tuition, for him to go to pre-K. But there are many families, most families out there cannot afford to do that. And so, my son and my zip code shouldn't have an advantage that another 6-year-old or 5-year-old, can't have because their parents can't afford pre-K. We feel very strongly that every child should have full day, high quality, school-based, with teachers, pre-K for 3- and 4-year-old and full day kindergarten, Keshia.
I think it makes a lot of sense, in addition to that it be placed under the auspices of the state education department, that there be congruity in all of those rules around pre-K, that there be articulation as it leads into kindergarten. And one of the things that is difficult when we look at the implementation of pre-K, it's not just whether or not there's funding, it's the rules that get attached to how that money gets spent, when it's given to districts, and those kinds of things. One of the significant issues that we always have with pre-K is transportation. If you're going to transport pre-K, it's not aidable like other grade levels. That's a disincentive to have pre-K there, and that's not incongruity. That doesn't make sense with trying to get more parents getting their kids into pre-K. And so a lot of those rules just kind of need that, let's do a common sense makeover of these regulations, and let's really work together to get more kids into pre-K.
Now, the budget also did not include money for English language learners. There are a number of districts statewide. I used to work for the Observer Dispatch in Utica, which has 42 different languages spoken. And there's no funding for these students. They don't know how to hold a pencil. They don't know how to use a light switch. They've never been in a country like we have here. And we're putting them in our schools in large numbers. And there's no extra funding to help. What should be in the budget in terms of ELL students? And I'll ask Larry to talk a little bit about the local level, and then Kyle on the statewide level as to what's going on.
So I think trying to address that specific, just through the budget process, ignores the major issue associated with this, which is that there are not enough teachers for ENL students. The state is not certifying nearly enough folks to meet that new demand by that new regulation. I'm not saying that the new regulations for ESL students is misguided. It's asking for an increased level of service for all of these students, and I think that they need it. I think they deserve the increased intensity of that service. But there are not nearly enough teachers in the state, and there aren't enough teachers being certified in order to meet that. And so where they should be putting those efforts right now is thinking about the teacher shortage, and why is it that we have such a precipitous drop in pre-service teachers, people who are looking to go into the teaching profession, and particularly in these areas where we've got major deficits, major gaps in service provision. And so it's not just that I don't have enough money. I've got money allocated to hire teachers that are for kids that are learning English, but I don't have candidates to hire. And that's the case across the state, and that's where there needs to be some strategy.
Add to Larry before we talk about the funding piece is that we have seen an almost 40% drop of teacher candidates entering and exiting our teaching colleges. And I can probably equate that to the stress that teachers are facing and some of the blaming that teachers have been facing the past few years. We have lost tens and tens of thousands of educators since the recession hit. We are not where we need to be on the number of teachers in our in our schools and a number of teacher candidates. On a money-wise level, the statewide education groups have asked for $75 million in a special funding stream for districts with high L student population. And also, there's another term that's commonly used. It's called SIFE students, students with interrupted formal education. And these are different than the typical English as a second language student. It's a student that really has no formalized education before they come to North America. So we have two very unique school populations when we talk about L students. We feel very strongly, and as do the other statewide organizations, that we have to support those students, their families, and the educators that serve them. And there is not, as you mentioned, Keshia, a dedicated funding source for those students. It was disappointing.
Just one more budget topic. What should the legislature adopt that's not in the executive budget? Right now we're going into this period where they're going to be starting discussing. Each house is going to give its own budget, and then hopefully they'll remedy it in the middle on time. Is there anything specific other than what we have talked about that both of you would look for from the legislature?
Well, I always look for foundation aid. It's the biggest gap. It's the place where it's not just the largest amount of money that's the gap. It's where we have the most significant equity gap. And the place where I've pushed specifically with our legislators is around the receivership piece. I don't think that they're going to be able to get all of foundation aid restored, but I've asked them to, at the very least, put something in law that says no school can be placed into receivership until the state has at least given them 100% of their foundation aid for 2 years running.
And we would agree with Larry. There's
Those are words I don't hear enough. By the way.
Again, we're calling for the complete elimination of the GEA, because that, needs to be done. Especially, we have a $5.4 billion surplus right now. Half of that is recurring, so the state has money to really make schools whole. We too believe that foundation aid is absolutely critical. There was a few $100 million in the governor's budget for foundation aid. We are calling for over $1 billion for foundation aid to make a serious commitment to paying down the Campaign for Fiscal Equity figures. Tax cap. There's nothing in the budget on the tax cap. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we're pushing for collectively with your association and other associations. Because we have such a low and devastating tax cap, states can't, or local districts really can't make up any of that money locally. And we were hoping to see some changes to the tax cap in the budget. We are still pushing for that. I'm optimistically hopeful, but practically, realistically not hopeful. But something that you should always talk about. And I know Rick and Bonnie are amazing advocates for you. I have a pleasure of working with them on now a daily basis. I think we communicate. So hopefully we can see some tax cap changes in the near future. We have called for a full repeal of the receivership law. Like Larry, we feel that the law needs to be repealed and replaced with a supportive measure, something that we're also pushing. But one thing that was positive is that in